When the UN started documenting civilian casualties in Afghanistan in 2007, we found that increasing numbers of civilians were being killed by airstrikes, in ground engagements, by improvised explosive devices, and by escalation of force or at roadblocks and checkpoints.
You have a very baseline standard when it comes to the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. There's the principles of humanity, military necessity, distinction, proportionality, and then also for a warring party to take all sorts of feasible precautions during the conduct of hostilities. Now, some of these engagements that were resulting in high civilian casualties were not necessarily, were not violations of the law of armed conflict. And were also within the rules of engagement for some of for both ISAF as well as for the individual troop contributing countries in the ISAF operation. But civilians were dying.
I think we need to start by remembering just what a big departure 2006 was for NATO and ISAF. Up until that point, we had basically been doing fairly traditional sort of almost peacekeeping-like activities around Afghanistan. But in 2006, of course, that all changed. When we took on responsibility for the South in the summer of 2006, and then by October of 2006, the responsibility for the Eastern provinces, all of a sudden, NATO and ISAF had literally, over the course of 3 or 4 months, inherited a vicious fight against the Taliban-led insurgency. I don't think we were prepared, quite frankly, for mitigating properly the civilian cost. And what we found very quickly was that the proportion of civilian casualties for which ISAF was responsible started to climb. And it started to climb quickly.
Well, there were various kind of incidences. Some of them involved night raids where soldiers would go after a particular target, a high-value target, and certain civilians had been killed in those incidences. Or even close air support where a particular unit is under attack and calls in for support to counter that defensive threat because they don't have the capability to deal with that threat.
What we've found over the last many years is that the insurgents here, the Taliban, the Haqqani network, and some of the others, do not abide by international humanitarian law principles. They are bound by it as a party to the conflict, but they do not abide by it. And one of the key principles is that all warring parties must make a distinction between civilians who are protected and cannot be attacked and combatants or fighters who, if they're fighting, are what we would call a legitimate or a lawful military objective. So what we've found is that insurgents aren't making that distinction. They have been deliberately attacking civilians, and also they are attacking military objectives, but in a way that's indiscriminate, meaning civilians often get killed and injured in crossfire or by a big IED that's put in a park where civilians are walking. One particular deadly kind is called a pressure plate improvised explosive device. And this is triggered by a victim. For example, any person, including a child, walking over one of these IEDs or any vehicle like a civilian minibus driving over will blow it up and will kill or injure the victim. We have really urged the Taliban and the other anti-government fighters to stop using these illegal and indiscriminate weapons. Other types of IEDs, such as remote-controlled and magnetic, are also being used. Theoretically, they are supposed to enable better sort of targeting. However, as I said, we have not seen much of a change. IEDs still kill and injure hundreds and hundreds of civilians every year. One new and very worrying trend we've seen in 2014 is that more civilians are being killed and injured in ground engagements or actual fighting between insurgents and Afghan forces than any other tactic. While in the past, IEDs killed more civilians than anything else, we've seen now, over the last months in 2014, ground engagements killing the most civilians, the most women and children. And this really is the warring parties fighting on the ground at checkposts around civilian populated areas, with mortars being fired into civilian areas, small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenades. These things, the parties are firing at each other, and civilians are being caught in crossfire and increasingly being killed and injured through these tactics.
So we started realizing very quickly, I think, particularly from the reaction on the Afghan side, just how serious an effect this was going to have. Not only, again, for the affected communities, but also in terms of our own mission accomplishment. And there was a recognition, I think, from a political perspective, that two things. Number one, this could put our mission accomplishment at serious risk, in particular because we risk losing the support of the Afghan government and the Afghan people. Number two, this was starting to lead to very difficult questions, quite rightly, in our own domestic constituencies.
جنگ که تا فعلا تو وانمود میشه که بر علیه القاعده و طالبان است، شاید جنبه ملی پیدا کند، چون
ډیر امریکایانو په خپل سربمباري وکړلې یا بل کوم هغه وکړو، نو په دې وجه کورونه یې تلاشي کړل بې اجازې، بې ملي اردو بې پولیسو بې اجازې، نو په دې وجه هغو ته خلکو نفوس ورزیات شو.
والا کمک میشه دیگه، کمک ها معلوم نیست کجا کمک میشه، کلش گم است.
وقتی که حمله میکنن ناتو در چی اول برای خبر میتن که شما این مثلا همین جای تخلیه کنین، مردم چون یک بدبینی هم رایج داره نمیکنن. اونموت وقتی که هوایی فایر میکنه سرشان یا هوایی بمباردمان میکنیشون و مجبور مردم عوام زیر پای میشه دیگه.
I think it was the 2007 incident in Azizabad in Chindan province where I think over 80 civilians had been killed, where I think there was huge outrage by the Afghan government and civil society.
ISAF said one thing, the UN said other things, the accusations flew back and forth, and in the end, no one in the Western region was very happy with ISAF's reaction, because the first reaction was very unequivocal. This is what we did, this is how many died, and that is it. There didn't seem to be a dialogue.
What I want as a citizen in this country or as a human rights defenders generally is accountability and justice for every single mistakes done by anyone. Done by anyone, by our own army, by NATO forces, by anybody, because we need to respect the human rights. We need to respect the rule of law and accountability and justice.
Once we documented and reported on civilian casualties caused by all parties, including international forces, we began a very intensive dialogue with NATO ISAF forces. In order to get the best result, we felt it was very critical to have an open, constant, regular dialogue with NATO ISAF forces, with government forces, and also with insurgents. It's the only way we saw that we could get an actual reduction in casualties and change their practices and procedures.
I think in the last decade of international forces being in Afghanistan, there are some very hard lessons that I think the international forces learned and the Afghans learned themselves. But I think the international forces realized some of their mistakes and tried to change course and try to be more responsible. So they tried to enact policies that would reduce the impact of war on civilians, which I think took a while to come to that, but it did happen. And I think then the commander, Dan McNeil at that time, ISAF, decided to issue a first tactical directive to prioritize civilian protection during the conduct of hostilities, and to try to limit or have more precautions or more guidance or layers of steps that forces should be taking before they call in an airstrike.
This is Windmill, talk to my ground commander. The Taliban is also using women and children as a human shield, so we're not going to perform warning shots due to collateral damage. How copy?
I believe it was, I think, ISAF McKiernan in 2008 to assess and decide that they needed to track how they were causing civilian harm and keep a track of their own data. And so they created a civilian casualty tracking cell in 2008. And it's interesting, no military force has created a civilian casualty tracking cell to assess the impact of their operations on the civilian population. So this was the first ever tool that was created. Some of the change in tactics and guidance that were issued were on how to call in airstrikes and close air support, when to use force in escalation of force procedures, to limit night raids to just only circumstances, and it eventually led to only Afghans leading the night raids, and then to have very robust analytical capabilities of all the data, of all kinetic operations that were coming in, to suggest how you feed into to pre-deployment training on civilian harm mitigation, on how to do in-mission trainings to troops on the ground to take the additional precautions to minimize harm to civilians.
The first key element for me was, without any doubt, it was leadership. It was leadership. It was General McChrystal, for example, coming in 2009, having a fundamental rethink of the mission and deciding to change the entirety of the ethos of what we were doing. Up until that point, our role, our key center of gravity was fighting the insurgency. From McChrystal onwards, it became, no, this is going to be a population-centric counterinsurgency mission, where the center of gravity was going to be doing everything we can to protect the Afghan population. That was a massive shift. The second issue for me was we finally recognized the importance of training. I would say, in the 7 years I've been looking at this, the best protection we can offer civilians is training of our personnel. The third element for me probably would be having the right mechanisms to understand the problem. New York City Mayor, former Mayor Michael Bloomberg always used to say, hey look, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And what was essential for us was having the right tools to measure and therefore manage. And what started off as a very small group of people called the Civilian Casualties Tracking Cell, who had a mandate to record all civilian casualties in Afghanistan, that gradually expanded to, in 2011, the Civilian Casualties Mitigation Team, which was quite a robust team of people that had a mandate not just to record casualties, but to analyze them, to understand them. What went wrong? How did this happen? And to then take that information and send it out so that lessons could be learned, so that new training could be applied, so that we could stop making those same mistakes over and over again.
You know, IEDs are the leading cause of civilian casualties in Afghanistan. And it's interesting that over the last few years, the Taliban sort of learned a little bit of playbook from ISAF, in the sense of they realizing that it is in their strategic interest to get the support of the population in the fight. And so they have, they have issued codes of conduct on not targeting civilians, but its implementation of those codes of conduct vary from a particular Taliban unit to another one.
What we have tried to do over the past several years is have a dialogue with the Taliban on measures they can take to reduce civilian casualties. What we have seen is, as a result of all of this and the very public reporting that's going on, is the Taliban's messaging on protection of civilians has changed. They have said frequently over the last couple of years that they are taking measures to protect civilians. They have called on civilians to protect themselves, which is not quite appropriate. However, while the messaging has changed, we have not seen a real change on the ground, with continuing numbers, escalating numbers of civilians killed and injured by Taliban. They even admit that they kill certain civilians in their statements, and by other elements that are fighting the government.
I think that another feature which I think is very unique to, and I think should be touted and praised, and should be tried to be replicated in other conflicts and by other warring parties, is trying to assist civilians that have been harmed, even if if it's incidental harm. And as the laws of war only obligate warring parties to investigate war crimes and to make compensation for violations. There is no legal obligation to assist civilians that have been harmed incidentally or in the crossfire. And so you have an entire category of people who have who are just excluded from any assistance.
And obviously, one of the most important things that can be done is to amend that harm, not just for the family, but sometimes for the affected community more widely. Now, we looked for quite some time at some sort of a NATO-wide policy that could address the very delicate issue of amends. And what we finally found was that when you have 49 or 50 countries in a mission, you've got 49 or 50 differing legal interpretations when it comes to the question of amends. When is it applicable? When is it not? When does it imply some kind of legal liability? When does it not?
Commanders have started going at the field level and making apologies or giving some sort of in-kind assistance. And of course, it doesn't bring the family back, or the loved one back who'd been killed, or the home that was destroyed, but it does make a measurable difference in the life of a civilian who is recognized by a military force for even the incidental harm that was done.
In June of 2010, the North Atlantic Council was able to agree a set of non-binding guidelines for payments in cases of civilian casualties or destruction of civilian property. And those guidelines were then promulgated by then-Com ISAF General Petraeus. And we have fairly strong anecdotal evidence that those guidelines, despite being non-binding, did influence national policies in these areas. And so we did see changes in behavior of certain nations on the ground on the specific issue of amends.
I think Afghan civilians deserve a very strong and robust and response from their government and statements saying that they are going to make sure that their forces are not causing harm to civilians. If they want to win the strategic war against the insurgents, then they have to show action by policies, prescriptions, oversight, accountability, down from senior leadership in Kabul to a foot soldier somewhere in Helmand. And ISAF has come up with these very progressive tools and policies in terms of tactics, in terms of analytical capabilities to assess and reduce civilian harm. And it's absolutely essential for the Afghan government to take it on and incorporate it. Afghan government has been a lead critic of civilian casualties caused by international forces as well as by the insurgents. And now that they're in the lead, they need to show to their own people that they are taking these mitigating measures to reduce civilian harm during their security operations. And because it risks, the population turning against the Afghan government. Come December 31st, 2014, you can't blame the internationals for all the harm that occurs in Afghanistan. It is the Afghan government's responsibility to ensure that they have the right training, they have the right tools, and they learn from ISAF on how to mitigate harm to civilians and what precautions they should be taking.